There's Jane Mansfield. She had a very short career, and she got killed in a very bad way.
A flaming, grinding car crash ended the bright movie career of famed Jane Mansfield on June 29, 1967.
What happens when a child grows up inside a cult? For some of Hollywood's biggest stars, that question isn't hypothetical, it's their real story. One actor escaped at 16 after watching his brother die because the cult refused medical treatment. Another actress still carries the voice in her head that told her she didn't deserve to live. And one Hollywood legend had ties to the Church of Satan that ended in a car crash people still whisper about. The stories behind these 10 stars are more shocking than any role they've ever played. Jane Mansfield. Jane Mansfield's link to Anton LaVey's Church of Satan felt like something pulled out of a fever dream, yet every part of it unfolded right in front of Hollywood. It began in 1966, right after she attended the San Francisco International Film Festival. Instead of heading back to her usual circle of studios and photo shoots, she walked into LaVey's Black House in San Francisco, a Victorian home painted completely black from the roof to the porch. The place looked like a stage set built for the strange life LaVey lived. And when Jane stepped inside, something shifted around her. LaVey, who loved attention as much as he loved the dark ideas he played with, immediately gave her the title High Priestess of the Church of Satan. It was the kind of move that mixed publicity with shock value, and Jane knew exactly how the world reacted to anything she touched. Soon, there were photos of her sitting on tiger skin rugs, smiling beside LaVey, and wearing a pink and black Baphomet medallion that he claimed was made just for her. The pictures spread everywhere, and people didn't know what to think because she had always presented herself as a Catholic woman who prayed and raised her children quietly behind the glamour. She later praised LaVey in interviews and called him a genius and an interesting person. Though she insisted she was not a real Satanist, still, the connection deepened because of something far more personal. In June 1966, her young son Zoltan was mauled by a lion during a performance, a moment that shook her to the core. Desperate and terrified, she called LaVey. Rumors grew from there. Some said he drove her into darker rituals. Some said he stood on Mount Tamalpais and performed a satanic prayer for the boy's recovery. What people remembered was that Zoltan's condition began to improve, and the story took on a life of its own. Around that same time, LaVey claimed he had placed a curse on Sam Brody, Jane's lover, because Brody had openly mocked him. After that, Brody ended up in multiple car accidents, and soon LaVey's curse story became a whisper people passed around for months. Everything reached its peak on June 29, 1967. Jane was traveling toward New Orleans in a car with Sam Brody and their driver Ronald Harrison. The highway was dark. A truck up ahead was hidden in fog. Their car plowed underneath it, killing all 3 adults in the front seat instantly. The crash was so violent that rumors of Jane's decapitation spread across the world. But in reality, her head was scalped, not severed. The tragedy shook Hollywood so deeply that new safety bars were later added to trucks to prevent similar crashes. They became known as the Mansfield Bar. After her death, people tied everything together. They repeated LaVey's old claim that he had performed a destruction ritual directed at Brody. They replayed the photos of Jane in the Black House. They connected the curse stories, the lion attack, the rituals, and the crash, as if the pieces formed a single shadow stretching over her final year. Nothing was ever proven, yet LaVey kept implying that he had played a role, feeding the public's hunger for mystery. And so this strange bond between a Hollywood bombshell and a man who called himself the High Priest of Satan settled into pop culture like a story that refused to fade. James Dean. James Dean's pull toward the occult started like a quiet spark and grew into something that shaped the final years of his life. As the days went on, the interest stopped feeling like a simple curiosity and turned into a strange thread that connected him to Maila Nurmi, the woman the world knew as Vampira. Their friendship moved fast because both of them were chasing the same shadows. They slipped into a rhythm where late nights became their normal, and cemeteries felt like places where thoughts slowed down long enough for secrets to appear. Every meeting pulled them a little deeper together. They talked about spirits, they tried seances, and they played with ideas that most people avoided. Dean even told Hedda Hopper that he had an adequate knowledge of satanic forces, a line that spread quickly and created rumors that followed him for the rest of his short life. Normie lived in those worlds more comfortably than he did. She practiced occult rituals and built small spaces in her home where she could focus her energy. After her bond with Dean grew, she created a personal altar only for him. She placed his photograph there, lit candles around it, and added voodoo symbols that she believed carried power. One of the strangest pieces on the altar was a half-black and half-white voodoo doll meant to represent Dean's divided nature. Friends asked why she kept such an intense setup for him, and she answered in a simple way that explained everything for her. Because I'm a witch. She said she was trying to protect him from himself. She watched the way he lived, especially his love for fast cars and risky choices, and it worried her. She once said she used her magic to try to stop him from killing himself. Whether those rituals comforted her or frightened those around her, they became a steady part of her connection to him. Dean felt that same sense of danger. His premonitions about his own death were unsettling because he spoke about them as if they were facts waiting for a date. He told friends he believed he would die from a broken neck. He even hung nooses around his home as if he needed to remind himself that something was closing in. On September 30th, 1955, the night he crashed in his Porsche Spyder and lost his life, something strange happened in Normie's apartment. She had a golden dagger pinned to the wall above her altar, right above cutouts of Dean's eyes and ears. The dagger suddenly fell to the floor. People talked about that moment for years. It added another layer of mystery to a night already filled with fear and shock. Normie later said she had predicted his death at a party shortly before it happened. Her words spread quickly, and soon the media turned the story into something sensational. Whisper magazine printed a dramatic cover in February 1956, calling her Dean's Black Madonna and accusing her of causing his death with witchcraft. The scandal tore her career apart. Her show was canceled, her reputation was damaged beyond repair, and she was left carrying a myth she never wanted: Glenn Close. Glenn Close's childhood began in a world that looked calm from the outside but felt locked from the inside. She was 7 in 1954 when her father took the family into the Moral Rearmament Group, and from that moment forward, her life slipped into a path she never chose. The group had roots in Switzerland and carried the Four Absolutes as its guiding rules. Words like honesty and purity sounded good to strangers, yet inside the walls, these ideas were used to control every thought a child had. Her father, Dr. William Taliaferro Close, had been working as a physician for Mobutu Sese Seko in the Congo, and when he joined the group, he brought the whole family into something none of them fully understood. Glenn remained there until 1972, trapped through her teenage years and early adulthood, shaping her in ways she would spend years trying to untangle. She has explained many times how the group decided everything for her: what she wore, what she believed, even how she responded to simple moments. There was no room for instinct, no room for doubt, and no space for personal dreams. Members were taught to repeat the same words, the same lessons, the same ideas, over and over until they no longer questioned anything. If a thought slipped through that sounded personal or natural or hopeful, the group made you feel guilty, the kind of guilt that settled inside your chest and stayed there. She remembers how leaders discouraged critical thinking and gave simple answers to problems that needed real understanding. They pushed the idea that morality could fix everything while slowly stripping people of the ability to think for themselves. She later said that you were not allowed to do anything without feeling guilty for wanting it. Those years built a voice inside her that always questioned her worth. The years she spent there did not fade when she left. They followed her into adulthood, affecting the way she trusted, the way she loved, and the way she connected. She grew up to become one of the most powerful actors in Hollywood, yet she carried the invisible weight of her childhood through every chapter of her life. She has spoken about how the cult shaped her relationships and how vulnerability became something she avoided. She married 3 times, and each time she found herself struggling to build the kind of bond she hoped for. The shame she had learned as a child kept resurfacing, whispering that she did not deserve love or connection. The emotional damage ran so deep that she once admitted to hearing a voice urging her to end her life. She had to confront that darkness head-on through years of therapy. And even while earning acclaim and fame and admiration, she was still fighting the shadows planted in her mind when she was a child. Joaquin Phoenix. Joaquin Phoenix's early life started in a world that never felt steady. His family belonged to the Children of God, a group that began in the late 1960s and slowly grew into something far more troubling than a simple religious movement. Joaquin and his older brother River were born into it, and from the moment Joaquin arrived in 1974, the group shaped every part of their lives. Their parents, John and Arlen, who were called Amram and Yochebed inside the group, were seen as important members. John was even given a title that sounded grand, but meant very little in real life. The cult's leaders called him Archbishop of Venezuela and the Caribbean. It made them feel chosen. It also trapped them deeper. From the time Joaquin could barely walk, the family moved through Central and South America as missionaries. They lived in Venezuela, Trinidad, and a handful of other places, drifting from one temporary home to another. Every day was built around spreading the group's message and following the strict words of its founder, David Berg. The doctrine demanded communal living, obedience, and sacrifices that often pushed families into poverty. Joaquin's parents relied on donations and street performances to feed their children. Life was uncertain, yet they kept going because they believed they were serving a higher purpose. Things shifted in the late 1970s, and the turn was sharp enough to shake the entire family awake. In 1979, Berg introduced a disturbing rule called flirty fishing. It told women and even young girls to use sexual relationships as a tool for recruitment. The policy spread across the group quickly and brought thousands of new followers. But the moment Joaquin's parents learned about it, something in them broke. They saw the danger, they saw the twisted logic, and they realized they could not raise their children in a place that used people that way, so they walked away from everything they knew, carrying their children and a lifetime of confusion behind them. Leaving did not end the pain. The outside world felt strange. Their mother, who later became known as Heart Phoenix, said the years after they left were some of the hardest they ever lived through. It was a time filled with emotional wounds and a deep struggle to reconnect with normal life. They had spent years isolated from the world, and returning to it felt like learning how to breathe again. As time went on, more was revealed about the group they had escaped. Former members came forward and described widespread sexual abuse. They said Berg himself abused minors. They talked about a culture where children were not protected and where terrible things were ignored or quietly accepted. Joaquin and River had gotten out before the worst stories reached the surface, but the shadow of those early years stayed with them. River, especially, carried the weight. He battled addiction and emotional turmoil for most of his short life, and many people who knew him felt that his early trauma had carved deep wounds that never fully healed. Rose McGowan. Rose McGowan's early life unfolded inside the Children of God cult, a hidden world that shaped everything she saw and felt as a child. She was born in Florence, Italy in 1973, and her first 9 years were spent inside a commune, where her father, Nat McGowan, ran the Italian chapter. The group controlled nearly every part of life. It had been founded in 1968 by David Berg and had grown to almost 10,000 members by the late 1970s. And inside those walls, people lived cut off from the outside world. There were no newspapers, no television, no outside voices. Children rarely saw relatives who were not part of the cult. They were often separated from their parents and left on their own, learning early that affection and guidance were things you had to go without. Rose grew up watching adults submit to rules that made no sense to her, and that confusion stayed with her, even as she tried to make the best of every day. As she got older, she began to understand that the most disturbing part of the group was its sexual doctrine. Men were allowed multiple wives, and women were expected to satisfy men in any way demanded. Rose saw how these women were treated, And even as a child, she felt something tighten inside her every time she imagined growing up in that system. And it was not just about how the adults behaved. The cult promoted flirty fishing, a practice that pushed women to recruit new members through sexual relationships, even with minors. By the end of the 1970s, stories of child abuse spread within their own circles. Some leaders were accused of harming young girls, including their own daughters and granddaughters, and the danger felt close enough for Rose to sense it long before she fully understood it. Everything changed the moment the group started encouraging open sexual relationships between adults and children. Rose was around 9 when the fear became real enough to force a choice. One night, during a storm, she and her family escaped the commune. They ran through a cornfield while thunder cracked above them and lightning lit up the sky. Because her father had held a leadership position, they were considered high value to the cult and were chased as they fled. Rose remembered hiding while a man tried to break in with a hammer, and that moment carved its own place in her memory. Survival became the priority, and eventually the family made it to the United States, where they tried to build something normal. Life after the cult felt strange. Mainstream society seemed dull to Rose because everything around her suddenly lacked the constant intensity she had grown up with. She tried to fit in, but she carried memories that kept pulling her backward. At the same time, those memories shaped her in a way nothing else could. They pushed her toward speaking out, toward trying to protect others from the kind of manipulation she had witnessed. Her childhood became the root of her activism, and her escape remained the dramatic turning point that helped her see the world clearly. Patricia and David Arquette. Patricia and David Arquette grew up in the Skymont Subud commune in Virginia, a place that sounded peaceful when their parents first heard about it. Louis and Marty Arquette wanted a life filled with meaning. So in 1969, they packed up everything and moved to this spiritual community that sat on 146 acres near the Shenandoah River, about 12 miles south of Front Royal. Subud had started in Indonesia in the 1920s, and by the time it reached the United States, it attracted people who believed they could build a utopian life far away from noise and pressure. Families kept arriving, and soon as many as 750 people lived there. Patricia had been born in 1968, and David arrived in 1971, so they became some of the youngest children in a community that promised light, but ended up giving them shadows. Life at Skymont was simple in a way that didn't always feel gentle. There was no electricity and no running water. Bathrooms didn't exist inside any home. People lived in cabins or camp buildings that barely kept the cold out. Still, the children tried to find small pieces of joy. They swam in the river and the creek, created their own games, and wandered through the woods with a kind of freedom that comes only when no one has much to lose. Their parents wanted to raise them away from the rat race and closer to nature, but as time passed, the picture cracked. Adults struggled with substance abuse. Fights broke out. Poverty settled over the place like a permanent winter. Patricia later said they became so poor the government dropped off food for them because they had nothing else. It was the kind of childhood that left marks even when the children tried to stay hopeful. Things reached a breaking point by the mid-1970s. The ideals that once held Skymont together were falling apart. The community was no longer a place of peace, just a place where survival mattered more than spirituality. In 1974, when Patricia was around 6 and David was 3, the Arquette family finally left. Some memories stayed warm for certain siblings, like Richmond, who remembered friendships and open spaces. Others, like Patricia, carried the weight of the struggle and the emotional scars that came from growing up in a place that promised something beautiful, but delivered something harsh. Their time in the Skymont Subud commune became a powerful reminder of how dreams can twist when reality steps in, and how children often feel those twists more deeply than anyone expects. Christopher Owens. Christopher Owens grew up in a world that never felt open. His earliest memories were shaped by the Children of God cult, a place where rules pressed down on every part of life. He was born in Miami in 1979, but he barely stayed still after that. His mother, his sister, and the other members kept moving across Asia and Europe, carrying their beliefs with them as if the outside world didn't exist. There were no phones, no television, and no real school. Children were taught that the world beyond their circle was dangerous and corrupt. So Christopher learned his lessons in the streets instead. He learned how to sing for strangers and how to play guitar well enough to bring in a little money. That became his first real doorway into music, even though it came from a life that kept him small and hidden. As he grew, a deeper weight settled over the family. His older brother, Stephen, had died only months before Christopher was born. Stephen had caught pneumonia, and the cult refused medical treatment because they believed outsiders could not be trusted. His death was preventable. His mother carried that pain everywhere they went, and Christopher felt it even as a child. There was grief in the way she held him, in the way she moved through each day, and there was more silence when his father walked away from the cult and was never allowed contact again. Christopher learned early what absence felt like. He learned how it settles into a room and stays there. When he turned 10, his family moved again, this time through Western Europe, still doing missionary work. Life stayed narrow. He could only watch old musicals because they were considered safe. Everything else was blocked. Newspapers, radio, movies, even relatives who left the group were cut off. Anyone who walked away was called a backslider, and once they were gone, the cult demanded that no one speak their name again. Christopher grew up watching people disappear from his life without explanation. Sometimes he wondered what they saw on the outside. Sometimes he wondered if they were happier without the rules. Those thoughts stayed quiet, but they grew. At 16, something inside him shifted. It felt like a small crack at first, then a push, and finally the need to step into a world he had only glimpsed from far away. He escaped the cult and moved to Amarillo, Texas, where his sister was living. Everything felt new and confusing. Simple things like choosing his own clothes or walking into a store felt strange, but each small step created space for him to breathe. Slowly, he learned how to live without someone telling him what to think or who to avoid. And after some time, he found his way to San Francisco. That city felt alive in a way nothing else had. The streets were messy and loud and full of people trying to become someone. Christopher fit into that energy. He started turning all the things he had seen and felt into songs, and those songs became Girls, the band that brought his voice to people around the world. Winona Ryder. Winona Ryder's early life never moved in a straight line. It began to shift in 1978 when she was just 7, and her family packed up and moved to a remote 380-acre plot near Elk in Mendocino County. The place was called Rainbow. It wasn't a cult, and it wasn't a normal neighborhood either. It was a quiet, hippie-style commune where 7 families lived together, far from noise and far from anything familiar. There was no electricity, no television, no cars rolling by. The nearest town sat miles away, and the world felt small, but also strangely wide open. For 3 years, this was the space that shaped her. Days were filled with meditation and prayer, and long stretches of silence broken only by wind in the trees. Her parents were writers and editors who spent their time with counterculture thinkers like Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg. Winona became Leary's goddaughter, and that alone made her childhood feel like a whispered story people repeated with raised eyebrows. Life at Rainbow moved slowly, but never felt empty. Winona read every book she could find and wrapped herself around her favorite one, The Catcher in the Rye, which sat in her mind like a guide. Sometimes her mother hung a white sheet on the side of a barn and turned it into a movie screen for all the children. They watched old films like Gigi and An American in Paris as the night settled around them. These small screenings planted the first seeds of her love for acting, and with no modern distractions, her imagination took over everything else. She played in the redwoods with the other kids and treated the tree sap like a magical treasure. Every new day felt like another story waiting to be invented. When she turned 10, her family moved again, this time to Petaluma, and the sudden shift hit her hard. The quiet girl who came from woodlands and old movies now stood in a school where kids stared at her short hair and soft manner and decided she was an easy target. They bullied her and called her names and left her walking home with a tight chest and swollen eyes. The kindness of Rainbow felt very far away. Yet these moments pushed her inward in a way that changed her. Acting became her escape. Whenever life pressed too heavily, she slipped into stories the way she had once played with sap in the woods. Her parents stayed strict about one thing. They told her she had to keep a 4.0 GPA, and she could only work in films during summer breaks. So her childhood became a mix of discipline and bohemian freedom. She studied hard, she dreamed harder, and by the time she turned 15, she had landed her first major film role. The world she came from wasn't ordinary, but that was exactly what allowed her to step into Hollywood already carrying something different in her eyes.